What if I told you that a piece of jewelry sitting in your junk drawer right now, something you almost tossed into a donation bag last spring, could be worth more than your car? It sounds far-fetched, but this exact story has played out in thousands of homes where nobody had the faintest idea they were looking at a genuine treasure. And it keeps happening because most of us were taught to judge jewelry by how shiny or perfect it looks, when the real story is almost always hiding somewhere else entirely. In today's video, we're counting down 10 fake-looking jewelry pieces that are secretly worth a fortune. And by the end of this list, you may find yourself walking straight to a drawer you haven't opened in years. Stick around until the end, because the very last piece on this list is one that even seasoned collectors overlook, and it might just be the most valuable mistake on this entire countdown. Let's get started. Let me ease you in with something almost every family has quietly dismissed at some point: the chunky black Whitby jet mourning pieces that look like cheap plastic. This is always a good place to start because the mistake is so understandable, and I never want anyone watching this to feel embarrassed about having made it themselves. Picture a heavy black brooch or a long strand of matte black beads, the kind that looks like it came from a Halloween costume box shoved to the back of a closet. Most people glance at it, assume it's bakelite or plain plastic, and shove it right back in the drawer without a second thought. Real Whitby jet is actually fossilized wood, mined from a specific stretch of English coastline for well over 1,000 years, and carved by hand during the Victorian era into intricate mourning jewelry worn after the loss of a loved one. Genuine carved jet pieces with fine detail routinely sell from a few $100s up into the $1,500 range, and rare signed pieces with elaborate floral or figural carving have climbed past $3,000 at specialty auctions. In one notable case, a woman inherited what she assumed was a set of cheap black plastic buttons repurposed into a brooch, only to learn it was hand-carved jet from the 1880s, worth close to $2,200. The simple home test collectors swear by is the warmth test paired with a static check. Real jet warms quickly against your skin, and when rubbed briskly on fabric, will attract small bits of tissue paper the way amber does, something plastic imitations almost never replicate convincingly. If you've got a heavy black brooch tucked away that you assumed was worthless costume jewelry, it might be time to look again, because that dusty old mourning piece could be quietly waiting to become a meaningful discovery for your entire family. There's a strange psychological trick at play with jewelry like this, where the more irregular and imperfect something looks, the less valuable our brain assumes it must be, even though in the world of vintage design, the opposite is very often true. Now think back to those lumpy, irregular pearl necklaces with the slightly greenish or golden tint that never quite looked like real pearls to the untrained eye, the signed Miriam Haskell Baroque pearl clusters mistaken for dollar store beads. So many of these end up donated or sold for a few dollars at estate sales because they simply don't photograph like fine jewelry, and the irregular shape almost works against them in people's minds. Miriam Haskell built her entire design house around hand-wired glass Baroque pearls, intricate filigree backings, and Russian gold tone plating. And her earliest pieces from the 1930s and 1940s are wildly collectible today among serious costume jewelry enthusiasts. Signed Haskell necklaces with layered Baroque pearls have sold from $200 up to $900. And rare figural pieces or elaborate parures, meaning matching sets of necklace, bracelet, and earrings, have pushed past $2,000 at specialty vintage auctions. Some standout multi-strand pieces with hand-applied glass leaves and flowers have gone even higher when condition is pristine. The key test is flipping over the clasp or the back of a brooch and hunting for the tiny oval Miriam Haskell signature plate, which is often hiding beneath a rosette of tiny beads and easy to miss if you aren't looking closely. If you find one, that small signature is the difference between a thrift store curiosity and a genuinely worthy collector's piece that could be worth holding onto or selling at the right moment. So it's always worth taking those extra 30 seconds to check before you decide anything. This next one catches people off guard because the stones themselves genuinely look fake even under close inspection, and honestly, that's exactly the point, since the entire purpose of paste jewelry was to convincingly imitate something far more expensive: the foiled Georgian paste jewelry that looks like dollar bin rhinestones. Georgian paste jewelry, made primarily in the late 1700s and early 1800s, used hand-cut leaded glass backed with metal foil to imitate diamonds long before cubic zirconia or modern rhinestones ever existed. The craftsmanship involved was extraordinary for its time, with each stone individually faceted by hand and set into silver mounts closed at the back to protect the delicate foiling from moisture and tarnish. Authenticated Georgian paste rings and brooches regularly bring $500 to $2,000, and elaborate parures with matching earrings, necklace, and brooch have sold for well over $6,000 when the foiling remains intact and undamaged. Even single paste rings and worn silver settings have surprised owners at appraisal events, selling for far more than the flea market price originally paid for them. The tell experts look for is a closed-back setting, meaning you cannot see light through the stone from behind, paired with slightly irregular, hand-cut facets that catch light in a soft, almost candlelit way, rather than the sharp modern sparkle we're used to today. If an old ring in your family looks suspiciously like a costume piece but has that closed, foiled back, it deserves a second look from someone who actually knows what they're seeing. I know this one surprises people because micromosaics get written off constantly as souvenir junk from an old European vacation. The carved Italian micromosaic brooches mistaken for tourist trinkets. It doesn't help that modern factories now produce cheap printed imitations that look similar from across a room, which makes people even quicker to assume the whole category is worthless. Picture a small oval brooch showing a tiny detailed scene, a dove, a bouquet of flowers, or the Colosseum, made up of what looks like painted dots scattered across a dark background. Those aren't paint. Each one is an individually placed sliver of colored glass, sometimes thousands of them packed into a piece smaller than a silver dollar, assembled under magnification by hand. The finest micromosaics were produced in Rome in the 1800s, specifically for aristocratic travelers doing the Grand Tour, meant as a kind of luxury souvenir of their journey through Italy. Today, signed or exceptionally detailed examples sell from $800 up to $4,000, with elaborate scenic parures occasionally reaching well beyond that at major auction houses when the scene depicted is particularly rare or historically significant. The advice from appraisers is consistent. Examine the piece under magnification. If you can see individual glass tesserae rather than a smooth painted surface, you're very likely holding a genuine 19th century micromosaic, and that changes everything about what it's actually worth, transforming what looked like a forgotten souvenir into a legitimate piece of decorative art history. If you've ever seen a brooch set with banded gray, orange, or reddish stones, arranged almost like a plaid pattern, there's a good chance you dismissed it as inexpensive tumbled rock jewelry from a gift shop, the Scottish agate, and pebble jewelry mistaken for cheap, polished stones. It's a category that gets overlooked constantly, simply because agate itself is such a common, inexpensive material today that nobody stops to consider what it meant to own a piece like this in the 1800s. Scottish agate jewelry, sometimes called pebble jewelry, was wildly fashionable during the Victorian era after Queen Victoria fell in love with the Scottish Highlands and made tartan and native stones a genuine fashion statement across the empire. Skilled lapidaries hand-cut and polished native Scottish agates into elaborate silver settings shaped like thistles, shields, and Celtic knots, often taking weeks to complete a single elaborate brooch. A simple home test is checking the banding pattern under a strong light. Genuine agate shows natural, slightly irregular concentric bands, while glass imitations show air bubbles or an unnaturally uniform, almost machine-printed pattern. Signed Scottish silver pebble brooches and bracelets have sold from $300 to $200, and elaborate sets with matching earrings and a shield-shaped centerpiece have brought over $2,500 in specialty sales, particularly when the silver hallmark confirms an Edinburgh or Aberdeen origin. These pieces are worthy because they capture a very specific, romantic moment in jewelry history, and finding one in a family collection can feel like uncovering a small piece of royal-adjacent fashion history sitting quietly in a jewelry box. Before we climb into the top 5, there's something almost nobody understands about pieces like these, and it's the exact reason so many sell for pennies at yard sales, while sitting right under an expert's nose without anyone realizing it. Age and appearance tell you almost nothing. A piece can look tarnished, outdated, and completely unremarkable, while still being worth thousands, and a shiny, bright piece can turn out to be worthless costume metal stamped out by the thousands. What actually separates the two are small details most people never check. The closed back of a setting, a maker's mark hidden under a clasp, the specific cut of a stone, the type of hinge on the back of a brooch. That's exactly why I put together a short, free guide called the Hallmark Handbook, walking you through the same details. Appraisers quietly check before they tell a client what something is really worth. Grab it through the link in the description or the code on your screen, and let's get back to the countdown. We're now entering pieces that can genuinely shift someone's entire year, starting with the heavy Chinese export silver filigree jewelry mistaken for cheap souvenir metal. These pieces have a way of getting quietly passed down through generations of a family, following the exact path of whichever relative first traveled abroad, and rarely getting a second look once they land in a drawer. Ornate silver filigree necklaces, bracelets, and brooches brought back from Hong Kong or Shanghai by travelers in the early 1900s are frequently assumed to be inexpensive tourist silver, the kind sold by the dozen at port markets to anyone with a few coins to spare. In one memorable case, a family brought in a heavy filigree bracelet they'd assumed was costume jewelry from a relative's trip abroad decades earlier, and it turned out to be an early 1900s Chinese export sterling piece with fine granulation work, appraised at $1,800. The best home test is checking for a small stamped mark reading sterling, silver, or a maker's chop mark, along with genuinely fine symmetrical filigree work rather than stamped or molded patterns that repeat identically across the piece. Signed pieces with intricate dragon or floral motifs have sold from $600 to $3,000, and rare enameled examples with dense layered filigree have pushed considerably higher at auctions specializing in Asian export silver. These pieces are worthy because of the extraordinary hand craftsmanship involved, something almost impossible to replicate with modern manufacturing, and discovering one in an old jewelry box can turn a forgotten souvenir into a genuinely valuable family asset overnight. This is one of the most misunderstood categories in all of vintage jewelry, and I completely understand why. The tangle of old Victorian hairwork jewelry mistaken for creepy junk. I've seen entire estate boxes of otherwise valuable pieces get dumped simply because a single hairwork bracelet sitting on top made the whole box feel unpleasant to sort through. A locket or bracelet containing braided human hair understandably strikes most people as unsettling rather than valuable, and countless pieces have been thrown away simply because nobody wanted to touch them or even open the case to look closely. Victorian hairwork jewelry was an enormous and deeply sentimental tradition, often created as mourning jewelry to honor a deceased loved one, or occasionally as a token of affection exchanged between the living as a symbol of devotion. The finest examples feature astonishingly intricate, woven or braided hair patterns, set behind glass and gold-filled or solid gold mounts, sometimes accompanied by seed pearls or black enamel detailing along the edges. Well-preserved signed pieces with elaborate tablework braiding have sold from $400 up to $1,500, and rare pieces attributed to known Victorian hairwork artisans have reached considerably higher at specialty auctions focused specifically on mourning and sentimental jewelry. The test here isn't chemical or visual so much as historical. If a piece has an inscribed date, initials, or an accompanying note tucked inside the case, that provenance alone can significantly boost its value. These pieces are worthy not just financially, but emotionally, connecting whoever holds them to a genuinely personal moment in someone else's life from more than a century ago. Nearing the top, this one gets dismissed constantly because the stones themselves genuinely look artificial at first glance, the retro 1940s rose gold cocktail rings with stones that look obviously synthetic. Ironically, that same obvious, almost theatrical color is precisely what makes the era so recognizable and so beloved by collectors who understand exactly what they're looking at. Big, warm rose gold cocktail rings from the 1940s often featured large synthetic rubies or sapphires created using an early lab-grown process, intentionally set into bold, sculptural retro designs meant to look dramatic under evening light. People assume the whole ring is costume jewelry because the stone looks too perfect and too vividly colored, when in reality the gold itself is solid, 14 karat or 18 karat rose gold, and the ring's design and craftsmanship carry substantial value entirely independent of the stone sitting in the center. Quality retro rose gold rings from this era routinely sell from $800 to $2,500 based purely on gold weight and design, with rings by known makers like Retro Tiffany or Cartier pieces from this exact period climbing into the tens of thousands at major auction houses. These pieces are worthy because of the sheer weight and purity of the gold used. Art, along with the bold sculptural design language of the retro period that collectors actively seek out today for its unmistakable confident style. If you have a heavy rose gold ring with a large, almost too vivid colored stone, it deserves a proper weigh-in and evaluation rather than a dismissive glance and a shrug. This one carries genuine emotional and cultural weight. The old pawn Native American turquoise squash blossom necklace, a piece so many households have somewhere in a closet after a trip out west decades ago, usually assumed to be nothing more than a nice souvenir. A heavy silver necklace with a horseshoe-shaped Naija pendant and rows of blue-green stones is frequently assumed to be modern tourist market silver, mass-produced and sold cheaply at roadside stands along a highway. Old pawn squash blossom necklaces, however, made by Navajo and Zuni silversmiths primarily between the 1920s and 1950s, used naturally sourced turquoise and hand-stamped sterling silver, with construction techniques that simply are not replicated in modern commercial pieces made for the tourist trade. Necklaces attributed to known family workshops have sold from $2,500 to $6,000, and exceptional examples with natural, untreated turquoise from historic mines like Bisbee or Lone Mountain have reached well over $10,000 at specialty auctions focused on southwestern jewelry. These necklaces are worthy because of their cultural significance, hand craftsmanship, and increasingly limited supply of natural, untreated turquoise, which has become far scarcer than most people realize, as older mines have closed one by one. Take a proper look at any old squash blossom necklace passed down in your family, because the discovery can genuinely be life-changing for whoever ends up holding it, and it's a reminder that not every treasure travels in a velvet box. And finally, we reach the pieces designed by names so exclusive that most people have simply never heard of them, which is exactly why they slip through estate sales completely unrecognized. The unsigned Belperon and Schlumberger pieces mistaken for costume jewelry. These are the rarest finds on this entire list, but they're also the ones that remind us why every single item deserves a second look before it's ever dismissed. Suzanne Belperon famously refused to sign her work, reportedly saying her style was her signature, and John Schlumberger's earliest pieces for private clients were similarly often left unmarked entirely, with no maker's stamp anywhere on the piece. A Belperon chalcedony and gold cuff, dismissed for years as costume jewelry within one family and worn casually to garden parties, was eventually authenticated and sold for over $175,000 at auction. These pieces surface far more often than people expect, sitting quietly in estate collections, mistaken for bold, chunky costume design because the aesthetic itself was deliberately unconventional and ahead of its time. Examine any unusually sculptural, heavy gold piece with an unfamiliar clasp mechanism under strong light, and take it to a specialist who knows these makers specifically, because generic appraisers frequently miss them entirely and undervalue them by a wide margin. That tiny detail, an unusual hinge, an idiosyncratic clasp, an unmistakable design signature even without an actual signature stamped anywhere, could change everything for you and your family, connecting an ordinary-looking piece to one of the most quietly celebrated names in 20th century jewelry design.